Protests are a really important part of American history. There were protests before the United States even existed as a country, like the Boston Tea Party, the real Tea Party, and then the Revolutionary War, which was a major protest, and they've gone on from there. In this, I'm only going to talk about the protests in the United States, and I'm not going to talk about all of them because there's way too many. From about 1848 through 1920, women were fighting for the right to vote. This was the suffrage movement. It was very long, over 60 years, with a little break in the middle for the Civil War. And it was very difficult. Can you believe that when my mother was born, women didn't even have the right to vote? The labor movement in the United States was around the same time as the suffrage movement, although it did last a little longer. People were fighting for better working conditions. Working conditions were often very dangerous, for more money, to stop lockouts, and to end child labor. It was a very violent time in our history. And then came the demonstrations that were televised. So people across America could sit in the comfort of their living room, turn on their television, and watch these protests. The anti-war movement, the anti-war in Vietnam movement, was also called the student protest and started on the steps of Columbia and in Berkeley. People sat glued to their television during the civil rights movement, or at least during the peak of it, which came in around in the early 60s. But it started before then. It started in the early 50s with Brown versus the Board of Education, and then with Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks refused to sit in the back of the bus, and she was thrown off the bus, which started the big general strike. And then it moved on, and the late, great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King started the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which led to many other struggles and violence from the police force and the local citizens in the South. He then led the March on Washington. I think it was called the March on Washington for Freedom and Jobs. Not positive. But at the time, it was the biggest march ever in Washington. And it was at that protest where Dr. King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And this led the way to the strongest civil rights legislation since the Reconstruction. I didn't know anything about the plight of the migrant farm workers until I was in high school working at a local grocery store, and picketers were outside asking us to boycott lettuce and grapes. When we asked them why, they explained about their working conditions and that they were spraying the fields that these people were working in with pesticides while they were there. And women were having miscarriages from this. People were getting sick. There were children working in the field, and they were really getting sick from it. Their living conditions were terrible. And it was just a whole really terrible situation for these people. So I decided not to eat grapes or lettuce, and I didn't do it for 3 years. Then I saw Cesar Chavez, who was the leader of the farm workers, which eventually became the United Farm Workers. And he was on television with Bobby Kennedy. And I listened to them, and I got my first activist crush. In 1969, there were still sodomy acts in New York and other places all over the United States. And it was still illegal to have homosexual relations. Can you believe that in 1969? There was a bar, the Stonewall Inn, on Christopher Street in the Village in New York. It was a dive, really. It was not a nice place, but it was where gay people could hang out and just be who they were. They were always being harassed by the local police, and they would just go on doing what they were doing after the police left. But one night, they just said, enough. The police came in to harass them, and they fought back. And this led to several nights of really violent riots, known as the Stonewall riots. And this was the beginning of the gay pride movement. The women's liberation movement happened at the same time that all this other stuff was going on, and there was all these other protests going on in the country and marches going on in the country. Nobody was really letting the women in or inviting the women to come in. So the women made their own. This is when feminism started. This is when women said, I'm not staying in the kitchen anymore. And women changed their Miss and Mrs. to Ms. El Salvador had been an oligarchy for quite some time, and the people more or less lived like their serfs. There was always sporadic violence, but the death of the Archbishop Romero turned it into an all-out civil war, and then right after that came the rape and murder of 4 American churchwomen, and that was it. The group was formed called Farabundo Marti Liberación Nacional, and they fought the right-wing government and their death squads. Over 75,000 people were killed during this civil war, which was aided by the Reagan administration. There were huge protests in the United States to stop the intervention in El Salvador. Women had already been through a long and difficult fight to get their right to choose, and during the Reagan administration, they wanted to take that away. There were several demonstrations for women's reproductive rights. I always wore a button that said, "Keep your laws off my body." I even wore a necklace that had a hanger on it to remind people of what it used to be like if a woman needed an abortion. The Million Man March was in Washington, D.C. in 1995. I want to get some things out of the way first, which is talking about the person who organized it, who was Louis Farrakhan. He was a tremendous anti-Semite and misogynist. And these were the things that he preached to his followers. However, a lot of good came out of this march. The speakers spoke to the crowds about taking responsibility in your communities and getting very involved. They spoke about the importance of taking responsibility as a father and raising your children. They also spoke about the importance of adoption, and adoption went up quite a bit after this. They spoke about the importance of voting, and they registered over 150,000 people right there, and there's no telling how many people they registered to vote after that. In brief, this movement promoted African American unity, it promoted family responsibility, and the dignity of African American men. The Dakota Access Pipeline was stopped by President Obama after months and months of protest by the Sioux tribes. However, with the new president, he put it back on the table. And even though the Sioux tribes are claiming that this is their sacred land and it's their only source for clean water, the Army Corps of Engineers and the oil companies really don't seem to care. So they're still protesting all through the freezing cold, snowy winter. The Black Lives Matter movement started when George Zimmerman was acquitted of murdering 17-year-old unarmed Trayvon Martin. It was then exacerbated with the police shootings of Eric Gardner and Michael Brown. There was rage throughout the country at police shootings of young black men and protests everywhere. As a result of these protests, body cameras have become a normal part of a police uniform. The country has become very divided with the election of Donald Trump for president, which can be shown in all the protests that have happened since his election. They started on his inauguration night around the country, But the day after his inauguration was the Women's March on Washington, the biggest march that Washington had ever seen. It was women from all over, and marching with these women was wonderful. It was Jewish women and Muslim women and black women and white women and Catholic women and tall women and short women and skinny women and fat women and women everywhere. And the Women's March on Washington didn't stop the protests. They've still been going on every weekend and plenty of weeknights since then, and it doesn't look like they're going to be stopping anytime soon.